Submerged beneath the waters of the Solent off the coast of the Isle of Wight lies one of the most remarkable prehistoric archaeological sites ever discovered in Britain. And how do we know about it? Because of an angry lobster. In 1999, divers watched as a lobster chucked flint tools out of its burrow on the seabed. This hinted at ancient human activity on this once dry land, but the true extent of this site could barely be imagined at the time. Bouldnor Cliff preserves the remains of a Mesolithic forested landscape that, more than 8,000 years ago, was a seasonal encampment for hunter-gatherer communities long before rising sea levels submerged it. What makes this site of particular importance is that thanks to the unique underwater conditions, organic materials that would normally decay have survived for thousands of years, providing an exceptional window into life there at the end of the last ice age. And what's even more impressive is that marine archaeologists have discovered, based on amazing finds from the site, that these Mesolithic people were more technologically sophisticated than would be expected 8,000 years ago. In fact, they were 2,000 years ahead of their time. Even more crazy is that they appear to have had connections with communities living in the Paris Basin and southern Europe. How else do we explain their particular flint knapping techniques, or the discovery of domesticated wheat there long before farming arrived in Britain? Dives have been taking place at Bouldnor Cliff for more than 20 years, but because of the threat of coastal erosion, these investigations are now more important than ever. Let's see what Maritime Archaeology Trust's work tells us about this fantastic site and the people who frequented it 8,000 years ago. Today, Bouldnor Cliff lies around 11 metres beneath the waters of the Solent, the narrow stretch of sea separating the Isle of Wight from southern England. But 8,000 years ago, this was a thriving river valley surrounded by woodland, where Mesolithic hunter-gatherers exploited the rich natural resources around them. Bouldnor Cliff has yielded a wealth of finds, including preserved timber, worked flints, ancient hearths, and stone tools. Rather than being a single archaeological site, Bouldnor Cliff consists of 5 separate areas spread across hundreds of meters. 2 of these sites, BC2 and BC5, have produced the vast majority of artifacts and date between around 6,200 and 6,000 BCE, making them some of the most important Mesolithic sites ever found in Britain. When people inhabited this valley, the river that once flowed through it gradually deposited layers of sediment across its floodplain. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels began rising as the vast continental ice sheets melted. This caused the landscape around Bouldnor Cliff to change dramatically over several centuries. As the sea gradually advanced inland, the river became an estuary, and these deposits were sealed beneath thick layers of silt. Eventually, the entire landscape disappeared beneath the sea. However, it was this flooding that preserved it. Unlike archaeological sites on land, where wood, plant remains, and other organic materials usually decay, the oxygen-poor sediments beneath the Solent created ideal conditions for preservation. As coastal erosion slowly cut through these buried deposits, it exposed an archaeological time capsule that had remained undisturbed for thousands of years. The discoveries at Bouldnor Cliff have transformed our understanding of Mesolithic Britain. At one of the main excavation areas, archaeologists recovered almost 1,000 worked flints, including blades, flakes, scrapers, and finely made tools. At another, they discovered nearly 100 pieces of worked timber. That might not sound like much, but before Bouldnor Cliff was discovered, only around 50 pieces of worked Mesolithic wood had ever been found anywhere in Britain. Dating of the artifacts suggests that the sites were all occupied around the same time, between 8,200 and 8,000 years ago. They were likely used seasonally or semi-permanently. The researchers have been using photogrammetry to build 3D models of the various sites and some of the artifacts. Several of these can be viewed on their page on Sketchfab. Let's take a look at a 3D model of the site BC2. I'm going to read out the annotations. This is a 50 centimetre scale. There are two others around the survey area that are just visible in the texture map. The area recorded is broadly 8 metres by 8 metres. The longest length of the measuring tape is 4.2 metres. Here we see an overview of the eroding peat shelf where new and important Mesolithic finds are encountered on every dive, falling out onto the level of softer sediment below. Sediment-covered sandbags laid down to protect the highly sensitive Mesolithic material over previous seasons of investigation can just be seen here. This is the peat cap that developed above what would have been a riverine sandbar in a Mesolithic freshwater environment. The site was a focus for intense human activity circa 8,150 years ago, when the Isle of Wight was still connected to now mainland Britain and the now European continental landmass. This is the exposed Mesolithic land surface, a view of the landscape around 8,000 to 8,100 years ago and soon after the end of the last ice age. By contrast, this surface is formed of much more recent marine sediment and organic growth. All of the other layers are overlain by estuarine sediment that covered and preserved the Mesolithic landscape as sea levels rose. The most interesting archaeological deposit at BC2 is this layer of sand formed as part of a freshwater dune or sandbar that is now eroding out from below the covering peat. Large chunks of protective peat are being eroded and are collapsing downwards as the fine sand is washed out from beneath. Here is one example, with another large section here. These processes are continuous, with precious organic finds and evidence constantly revealed and often permanently lost. Despite this, numerous important finds have been recovered over the past 20 years and more. Here, an auroch bone was recovered in 2014, and in July 2017, the first tranche adze discovered on this site was also found in this spot. The preserved timbers include posts, stakes, split planks, platforms, and large worked trunks bearing clear tool marks. Wood chips scattered across the site suggest that trees were being actively processed there rather than simply used. One of the most impressive discoveries was an almost 1 meter long piece of oak that had been tangentially split lengthways. At the time of this discovery, the technique of tangentially splitting oak trunks wasn't known before the Neolithic, 2,500 years later. The earliest Neolithic example is from Haddenham Long Barrow in Cambridgeshire. Later on, during the Bronze Age, this process was used to build deeper log boats. The Bouldnor Cliff piece of oak would have come from a large oak tree measuring around 2 meters and at a height of several tens of meters. Various other timbers and string suggest that this site may have been for the construction of a log boat. Flints have been found which were repeatedly heated to a high temperature. Archaeologists think that these were used to hollow out tree trunks using controlled burning, the same method used in the later creation of dugout canoes. Overall, there's plenty of other evidence to suggest that this site was a boat building yard, which would make it the oldest one discovered so far in the entire world. On Sketchfab, Marine Archaeology Trust has uploaded a 3D model of one of the wooden platforms that was found at Bouldnor Cliff. This one is labelled as the Bouldnor Cliff BC5 platform, recovered July 2019. The description says, in 2019, a newly exposed feature was discovered at Bouldnor Cliff 5 site. It is made up of over 60 pieces of split and trimmed timbers, some of which are up to 1 meter long. Many were converted from the edge of a large tree. The timbers were laid in a position covering an area approximately 1 meter by 2 meters, although evidence of other structures can be seen in the adjacent seabed. 3 layers of flattened worked pieces were placed on top of horizontal round wood that ran underneath and perpendicular to the main structure. The feature appears to be a platform. It would have formed a solid surface or hard standing in its wetland setting, being close to a stream that ran down from the Isle of Wight. The platform was raised and recorded before being conserved. It's not clear what these platforms were used for. They were likely working platforms creating a dry environment in the wetland where industrial activities such as woodworking could take place. There's also the possibility they formed part of larger structures. It doesn't seem likely that they were floors of dwellings or jetties, though. The stone tools themselves are equally interesting. Several flint axes have carefully prepared cutting edges produced on both faces of the tool. This sophisticated manufacturing technique closely resembles Neolithic axes that wouldn't normally appear in Britain for another 2 millennia. Other blades show similarities to tools found in the Paris basin of northern France, suggesting that the communities living around the Solent were not isolated. Instead, they may have shared ideas, techniques, or even maintained contact with groups living across what is now the English Channel. That possibility becomes even more interesting when we remember the geography of the time. Britain was only just beginning to become an island. Sea levels were still rising, and large areas of land connected Britain to mainland Europe. Hunter-gatherers could have travelled across landscapes that are now completely submerged beneath the North Sea and the English Channel. Bouldnor Cliff was occupied only a few centuries before rising seas finally severed these land connections. Perhaps the most controversial discovery made at Bouldnor Cliff came not from stone or wood, but from microscopic plant remains. Researchers analysing ancient sediments recovered DNA from domesticated einkorn wheat dating to around 6000 BCE. If the dating is correct, this places wheat in Britain almost 2,000 years before farming became established there. The einkorn DNA was collected from sediment that had formed on the Mesolithic land surface at the site BC2. There is no evidence that the people living at Bouldnor Cliff were farmers. No cultivated fields, domesticated animals, or permanent farming settlements have been found at the site. Instead, many archaeologists believe the wheat may have arrived through exchange networks connecting Britain's hunter-gatherers with early farming communities on the European mainland. 8,000 years ago, farming was spreading across southern Europe, and many examples of einkorn wheat dating to that time period have been found there, whereas in Britain, apart from at Bouldnor Cliff, no other examples are known until 2,000 years later. The initial research was published in the journal Science, and it quickly generated debate. In 2015, a paper by Weiss and colleagues argued that the ancient DNA lacked the characteristic patterns of damage expected in genuinely ancient DNA, and suggested it was more likely to represent modern contamination or a false positive taxonomic identification from a very small number of DNA reads. The original authors responded in both a formal science reply and subsequent discussions, arguing that the critics had misunderstood aspects of their phylogenetic analysis. They also presented an additional radiocarbon date confirming the age of the buried soil from which the DNA was recovered, and maintained that the wheat identification remained robust. However, they acknowledged that the evidence indicates only the presence of wheat DNA, not the cultivation of wheat, and that the mechanism by which it reached Mesolithic Britain, whether through exchange networks, transport of grain, or another process, remains unresolved. The land bridges that existed at the time, along with the similarities in tool technology between the Bouldnor Cliff flints and those found in the Paris basin, do suggest that the acquisition of domesticated wheat via connections with Neolithic farmers in southern Europe is a plausible idea. But at this stage, it's still not possible to confirm exactly how it got there. The environment surrounding these Mesolithic people has also been reconstructed in extraordinary detail. By analysing pollen, preserved seeds, insects, and other environmental remains, researchers have been able to piece together a picture of the landscape as it changed over time. Initially, the valley was dominated by pine woodland. Later, oak and hazel forests spread across the area as the climate warmed. Eventually, conditions became wetter as sea levels continued rising. Marsh vegetation expanded, the river valley gradually transformed into an estuary, and finally, the entire landscape disappeared beneath the sea. Hazelnuts were an important food source for Mesolithic communities throughout Europe. Waterlogged hazelnut shells are often the remains of caches left by rodents, but carbonized shells show that people were deliberately roasting and eating them, providing direct evidence of food preparation thousands of years ago. The 2025 report from the Maritime Archaeology Trust discussed a few interesting new finds at the site. A pestle was found in peat around the roots of an 8,000-year-old tree. Such examples of food preparation are very rare in the Mesolithic. The changing landscape of Bouldnor Cliff shaped both the lives of the people who once lived there, but also influenced how archaeologists are able to study the site today. 8,000 years ago, this was a fertile river valley, an ideal place for Mesolithic hunter-gatherers to go about their daily life. As sea levels rose, the valley was gradually submerged beneath layers of silt, which helped preserve wood, plants, and other organic remains. But now a tidal channel has steadily eroded through these buried sediments, exposing a cross-section of this lost landscape. That erosion is what led archaeologists to Bouldnor Cliff in the first place. Yet the same process that uncovered it is also destroying it, making every archaeological dive a race against time. The discoveries there formed the basis of the 2011 Council for British Archaeology monograph, Submerged Mesolithic Landscapes of the Solent, and ongoing dives and research are posted about on the Maritime Archaeology Trust website and in their annual report that can be downloaded from the homepage. Bouldnor Cliff is the only confirmed submerged Mesolithic site in the UK and is therefore incredibly important to our understanding of that time period. Of course, Bouldnor Cliff isn't the only Mesolithic site in Britain to benefit from exceptional preservation. At Starcar in North Yorkshire, waterlogged conditions have preserved organic remains rarely found elsewhere, including timber structures, wooden artefacts, and evidence of life besides an ancient lake. Further north at Howick on the Northumberland coast, archaeologists uncovered the remains of what is thought to be Britain's earliest known large circular Mesolithic dwelling. And at Culverwell on the Isle of Portland in Dorset, excavations revealed a Mesolithic occupation floor, shell middens, and hundreds of flint tools. Sites like these are brilliant, but rare. Instead of ephemeral traces left behind in the landscape, they preserve evidence of camps, houses, tools, food waste, and everyday activities that would normally have disappeared thousands of years ago. Much of what they reveal is exactly what archaeologists would expect from Mesolithic communities. Small groups living seasonally, exploiting wild resources and making flint and stone tools and weapons. But every now and then, these exceptional sites produce discoveries that challenge our assumptions. At Starcar, for example, archaeologists uncovered a remarkable collection of red deer antler headdresses. Whether they were worn by hunters as disguises, used in rituals, or whether they served some other purpose remains a matter of debate, but they hint at a symbolic world that is far more complex than the archaeological record usually reveals. In much the same way, Bouldnor Cliff has produced discoveries that suggest Britain's Mesolithic communities may have been more technologically advanced and more closely connected to continental Europe than anyone once imagined. Let me know what you think about the Bouldnor Cliff site in the comments. I feel like it doesn't get enough coverage, or maybe I just haven't read that much about it, but it's an incredible site, and I'm going to keep an eye on all of the information that's being published on the Maritime Archaeology Trust website and keep you lot updated. Thank you for watching as always, and I'll see you next time.